All right, we're back. Cool. Okay, so now let's get down to business. The last two sessions I lied and told you we're going to download a video, an image, and now we're actually going to do it. So there are a couple things we want to be aware of. We're going to put this code together, and then we're going to pause and just reflect on what's happening and talk about it, because it can get a little hairy as far as concepts involved. First thing we're going to do, we've got our video object, which has hopefully an image URL string. It's kind of a verbose name, but we're gonna make sure that the video object actually has an image URL string. Braces on the same line, which I don't usually do, but we're doing it for this project. So constant image URL string. So because the URL string is an optional property, actually, and we should use constant video, because otherwise it's saying that we're using this optional, and we're not. So if we can grab this URL string, we want to create an actual URL. And we're going to do that. It's an NS URL. And we're just going to pass it the string. Constant image URL string. And the compiler might complain about this. Let's Command B and see if we're okay. All right, we're good. I was under the impression that this would return an optional, but it appears to not return an optional, which is fine. Actually, that's probably because we're passing in a non-optional, non-variable string. So now that we've got a URL, we want to fetch this guy from the server. And we're going to do that using a similar construct to what we use to fetch the JSON. And we're going to use the NSURL session, shared session, and we're going to say data task with URL completion handler. And we're just going to pass our URL here, and our completion handler, which is data response there. And that's going to give us a task, which we can say let task is equal to this. And let's look at what the compiler is telling us is wrong with using URL. Okay, so this is indeed, so it's saying, like, I can't rely on the fact that, maybe this URL is not a value. Maybe it's nothing, which is strange and misleading because we've said that it's a let, but as I suspected, NSURL returns an optional value. So we're just going to assert that we're going to force unwrap this optional because whatever. I mean, you probably wouldn't do it in a production application, but it's good enough for our purposes here. And my main concern, I don't like it when people say, "Oh, I would handle this error but my main concern is time. I don't want this to be like a 5-hour class. I want you guys to be able to, like, get in, get out, and get something out of it. So we're going to force unwrap that URL, which will allow this guy to do what it does, and we're going to say task.resume. And that, in doing so, we've set up a data task, very much like how we set up a data task in Vimeo client.swift here, but we passed in a request and it has a callback, right? We could make this image fetching logic perhaps a method on Vimeo client, but we're not going to right now. We're just going to do it here. Yes. So let us implement this. We're going to come back and do some optimizations after the fact. We're going to say if data do something, else if we don't have data, alert the user. Let's see. What is this guy telling us? Yeah, so if data does not equal nil, come on. My keyboard is extremely slow. What's happening here? Oof. Okay. If data does not equal nil, I want to initialize an image. And I'm going to say let image equal UI image. Wow. And I'm going to pass in data, and like so. So that should allow us to create an image object from our data.
Before we go any further, I'd like to take a step back and note a minor change that occurred between Swift 1.2 and Swift 2.0, and likewise Xcode 6.4 and Xcode 7. And that occurs in, or really it impacts this line of code and this line of code right here. So we are fetching an image, or rather we're fetching the bytes or the data that constitute an image. And what we want to do in the completion handler of our data task callback, what we want to do in the completion handler here is check to see if we get data back, because if we don't, we can't create an image. And if we do, use that data to construct an instance of UI image. And we're going to use that as we go forward. But I want to correct some things that you'll notice if you're using Xcode 7 and Swift 2.0. First of all, you're going to see a little error here in the margin. And it's going to give us a hint. Xcode is going to give us a hint as to what it's identifying as incorrect here. Value of optional type NS data not unwrapped. Did you mean to use exclamation mark or question mark? So basically it's saying that this argument here to the completion handler, this data argument, is optional, which we could also express like so. This is the true definition of this thing. If we tried to, for example, say, let's say this, it would flag this as a problem. Defining this argument as non-optional, i.e. without a question mark, is different than the definition of this method to begin with. So this method is intended to take these, the completion handler is intended to take three optional arguments: data, response, and error. And you can see that here. If we were to command click, or let's option click first, and look at the definition of this function, data task with URL, that we're calling here, we'll see the completion handler takes three arguments: optional NS data, optional response, optional error. So the first part of our little error right here is saying data is optional, and we need to handle that appropriately. So it's saying in order to pass it to this UI image constructor, so image with data, we need to unwrap it, or we need to be sure that it's not nil. And of course, I'm going to return this to its original state. The whole point of optionals is to give us a mechanism to hold a piece of data that could be a value or it could be nothing. It could be nil. So this constructor is saying, really, if you're going to use this UI image with data, you need to actually pass in some data. You can't pass in nil. And we can see that here. So if we explicitly try to pass in nil, and then we hit Command B to build, it's going to give us a different error. And it's going to say, cannot invoke the initializer here for type UI image with an argument list of type data nil literal convertible. So in plain English, that's basically saying you can't call this method with an argument that is nil. And that's basically another angle to look at this error that we're getting to begin with, right? You can't pass in an optional type because an optional type could be nil, and we know that we can't pass in nil. So we've got to pass in something that is actual data, actual bytes. So how do we do that? We want to modify this line of code here to make sure, to basically unwrap the optional, to make sure that we're either working with an actual value or we're not executing this line of code. So how do we do that? We've done this in a variety of places before we got to this point. And I'm going to revise this logic. Instead of saying if data does not equal nil, because really we haven't unwrapped it, it's still, data is still an optional value, I'm going to say if let data equals data. And in doing so, I am unwrapping, if possible, I'm extracting the value, the non-nil value from data, and I'm storing it in this other variable called data. This is confusing. We could also say, we could change the name of this. which I don't like to do, and I'll explain why in a second. But we want to unwrap the optional, and we do that with this syntax: if let real data. So like we're defining a new argument, a new variable here called real data, is equal to data, and that's syntax for just saying if we can extract an actual non-nil value from this variable called data, store it in the new variable we're creating called real data, and allow us into this first part of our if statement, our conditional. And that means that any code that we write inside this first part of our conditional, we can reference the variable called real data and know that it's not nil. It's a value that actually contains a piece of information. If for some reason we can't unwrap it and real data turns out to be nil because data was nil, we'll go into the else block, and maybe we'll alert the user, maybe we'll just print something to the console to give us a heads up that something went wrong or something unexpected occurred. So I don't like to make a new name for this, like real data. It sounds kind of silly. Convention is turning out to be in the Swift community that we literally just use the same name as the piece of data that we're unwrapping. I think that's a little bit easier. It's perhaps confusing for the beginner because you're like, what the hell does that mean? Data equals data? It seems like the same thing. But really, when we say let data, we're sort of overwriting the original name of data. So when we get to this point, we're saying, take the old value from data and try to put it in this new variable called the same name. And from then on, I can use data, and it is referring to the new value or the new variable that we set up here. It's a little confusing to get the hang of, but up here, we're actually doing something similar. If let const video equals video. So I've sort of changed my ways and am just overwriting the value that the name of the variable that we're trying to unwrap. But if we want to stay consistent, we can say if let const equals data, and then go ahead and create our image. We are getting a warning here, but this is no big deal. This is basically saying you're creating this variable called image, but you're not using it. And the compiler is telling us, hey, it's kind of a waste of space. Why would you do that? But the reason we're not using it is just because we haven't gotten that far yet. We're about to use it. So with that said, let's dive back into it. If I may summarize really quickly, data here is optional. This constructor cannot take in Xcode 7 and Swift 2.0 an optional value. So we need to unwrap it. And we're doing that with this one line of code, which means that we're actually passing in a non-nil value here, which means that we get an image. And we can continue with our original task, which is downloading this image and displaying it to the user. So with that, we'll jump back into the video. Cool. Thank you.